the presentation at ESMO is basically the outcome, or at least the first part of the outcome of a collaborative effort between ESMO and the London School of Economics. And the title is obviously where it was logical to go, the ESMO economic model for cancer medicines. So I'm looking at things from, let's say, economic, but also resource, but also health technology assessment perspective. So what I'm trying to do in this particular presentation is take the ESMO magnitude of clinical benefit scale one step further. And I'm going to try and explain what this one step further actually means. It means that whereas we have an understanding of the clinical value, and that means the clinical benefit and the safety and so on and so forth, value of a new cancer medicine, what we're trying to do with this collaborative effort between ESMO and LSE is to look at the value of the same medicine by incorporating a number of additional parameters of benefit. In other words, health economic parameters, burden of disease parameters, socioeconomic impact parameters, and so on and so forth. Okay, so it's not only the clinical benefit or the additional clinical benefit, but a range of other dimensions of benefit as captured by a methodological framework that we have put forward and put together for this particular project. The outcome of this effort will be to arrive at a geographically adapted value-based reimbursement model. And of course, reimbursement means coverage by the healthcare system. And when I say geographically adapted, we're looking obviously at different settings, different geographies, possibly different continents, but specifically different countries that obviously want to incorporate these additional dimensions of benefit. So the driving force for this relates to some of the concerns that we had originally about the market access dilemma for new medicines in general, but obviously through the ESMO collaboration, the market access dilemma for cancer medicine. So we're not only relying on safety and efficacy, or clinical benefit, if you will, in a clinical trial setting, but we are, from a healthcare system perspective, relying on effectiveness, in other words, how the drug performs in real life, efficiency, in other words, whether we allocate resources efficiently and effectively, but also affordability, in other words, whether the healthcare system can actually afford to pay for this new medicine. So this is the kind of direction we're taking in this collaborative effort, bearing in mind that we do have a range of criteria that decision makers actually deploy when making a decision about a new medicine, about covering or not a new medicine. If you're looking at the way that we cover medicines in the UK, for example, or in France, or many other European countries, we do have organizations such as NICE in England or HAS in France that effectively assess and appraise the evidence. And it's quite interesting to see that a significant proportion of that assessment and subsequently appraisal relies on an assessment of the clinical benefit, which is exactly, obviously, what the ESMO MCBS, the magnitude of clinical benefit scale, actually does. But in addition to that, they are reviewing evidence on not only clinical effectiveness, but also cost effectiveness. So it is very important, therefore, to take that into consideration when making a coverage decision. And I remind you that coverage decisions mean effectively what the healthcare system is actually willing to reimburse, and whether it is actually willing to reimburse a new medicine. But in addition to clinical and cost effectiveness, there may be additional criteria that reimbursement committees or health technology assessment agencies, pretty much like NICE and HAS, in England and France respectively, are implementing in order to see whether a medicine is basically satisfying certain other criteria. So we are using things like end-of-life criteria, for example, or severity as potential decision modifiers. So, for example, in the UK, we do have the end-of-life criteria whereby we accept a higher clinical and cost effectiveness threshold, that the ICER can be way beyond what it is normally for drugs that do not satisfy that particular dimension. And in countries like France, if you do not address severe disease and obviously improve on mortality, then you are unlikely to have the highest possible ranking in the therapeutic indication. So we want to explore, therefore, the importance of all these parameters and add all these parameters of benefit into the ESMO MCBS so that we can come up with a reimbursement model that has generic applicability across geographical settings. In order to do that, we use a number of sources. First of all, we have developed a methodology. We are meta-analyzing decisions, recommendations by health technology assessment organizations across several settings in Europe, but also Canada and Australia. In other words, countries that that are able to supply that information, and that information is publicly available and available in health technology assessment reports that are, again, available through their websites. We have developed that methodology. We're trying to extract the data from it, and we are reviewing a number of parameters, the quality of the clinical evidence, the clinical and economic restrictions, the cost effectiveness and budget impact analysis, but also, as I mentioned earlier, a number of additional dimensions of benefit which are called social value judgments. So if you're thinking about end-of-life criteria, this is a social value judgment. In fact, it is an explicit social value judgment because we have a particular metric for that purpose, which is explicitly recognized by a particular jurisdiction. That is NICE in England and SMC in Scotland. So we're trying to incorporate that evidence alongside uncertainties, in other words, concerns, both on the clinical side, but also on the economic side, that reimbursement committees and health technology assessment agencies have on the clinical evidence presented by the manufacturer of a new product. And we're trying to build a model which incorporates the clinical benefit, the clinical and cost effectiveness analysis, in other words, financial parameters, the funding type for the model, the clinical and other restrictions, the uncertainties that I mentioned earlier on, as well as the social value judgments, to see which ones are important predictors of health technology assessment decisions or recommendations. In other words, does a particular social value judgment have an impact on the direction of an HTA recommendation? In other words, because a new technology addresses severe disease, is that a predictor of coverage? So this is the kind of situation we're trying to address with a generalized model. We are in the first attempt of that particular effort. We've just built the model, and we have collected evidence from a panel of 78 or so medicine indication pairs, oncology medicine indication pairs across 6 jurisdictions, 6 countries, which has given us a sizable sample of about 400 plus drug indication per country observations. And based on that, we will explore statistically the relationship between the kind of variables that I described earlier on and the kind of outcome we are interested in other words, the HTA recommendation. I'll pause here and see, Hannah, whether that was clear or you want me to repeat or...
Very clear.
Whatever.
Can you just tell me which countries they are? Did you have that? Is that all right?
Yeah, of course, yes. So the countries we are looking at, as I mentioned earlier, relate to countries that do provide in the public domain the evidence and the reports on health technology assessment so that we can actually implement our methodology and extract the data we need. So the countries are England, Scotland, Australia, Canada at the federal level, Quebec as distinct from Canada at the federal level, because Quebec has got its own mind about things and health policy in Canada, in its own jurisdiction, and France.